I'm Rick Dior, and today we're going to talk about drum set snare drums, how to choose them, what types are best for what kinds of music, and how to maintain them as well. So I want to give you some criteria for purchasing a really good drum set snare drum. And you might ask, why are you saying drum set snare drum? Well, in my world anyway, there's two different kinds of snare drums. There's orchestral snare drums and there's drum set snare drums. And I use both, and I have several types of each one. So let me start by just explaining the difference between the two types of drums. So over here, grab this, we have an orchestral snare drum. This is a Pearl Philharmonic, kind of very common orchestral drum, very well made drum. And you see that the snares here, there's three different types, okay? So you have the curly snares, which are what are on a regular drum, drum set drum. All the snares are curly snares. Sometimes they use wire, but most of them are curly snares. And then here you have wire, and then here you have cable. And these can be swapped out for different things like gut and all kinds of types of snares. You also have a snare mechanism, or the strainer, that has three different adjustments for each snare. Most drum set snare drums do not have that. Again, because they have one kind of snare, so what would be the use of that? Okay? Other than that, there's no difference. So the shell constructions can be completely different, just like drum set drums. The heads can be different. This is a calf head on here. All right? That's pretty much it. The snare, strainer, and the snares themselves. So I'll put this aside. Now, on drum set snare, you have curly snares like that. Or you can have, like I said, cable. But either one or the other. The cable's going to sound drier. The curly snares are going to have a wetter sound. They'll also make your toms activate the snares more. Now, before I go on, let me show you one quick trick for stopping that tom ring for snares. I know a lot of you have asked me questions about this. So what I do, you see my voice actually activates the snares. So what I do is that I tighten the lugs closest to the snares. So there's two on each side, here and here. We'll get this with the close-up camera. And I'll tighten them one full turn tighter than the rest of the bottom lugs. That, believe it or not, gets rid of about 50% of that snare ring. So there's an old trick for you. It's been around for a while, but some people don't know it or use it. And it doesn't affect the drum sound in a bad way. I don't find anyway. So let's give you my criteria for choosing a drum and for purchasing a drum. Now, snare drums can be really expensive, good ones anyway, so it's important that you know this so you don't make a big mistake. My first criteria is sensitivity. So if a drum is sensitive from its softest playing to its loudest. In other words, you don't lose tone, you don't lose snare sound. This particular drum is sensitive in all dynamic ranges, from soft to loud, okay? It doesn't lose its sensitivity. That, I believe, is because it's got really good bearing edges, which are these right here. You see them? Okay, hopefully you see them. And these are really steep bearing edges. So that's what the head sits on. They're not flat, they're angled. And this is a very steep angle, almost 90 degrees it looks like. And razor sharp, okay? Now, also what makes a difference in the sensitivity are snare beds, which you can, this drum really doesn't have much of a snare bed, but you have a cutaway of the bearing edge, and that's where the snares sit when you tighten them. And sometimes that helps with sensitivity. Not always, but sometimes it does, okay? So you can check out different kinds of snare beds. You can even cut them in, or if you don't like the sound of a drum, you don't really care about it, you can experiment with sanding them. I've done that before. Actually, it hasn't ever helped, but I've done that before. So, but that's one thing that can change the sensitivity of a drum. All right. The other thing are heads. Never be afraid to change a drum head to a different kind of head. I mostly use Remo Ambassadors. I'm not a Remo endorser, but that's what I've always used, and they work for me. I use sometimes these skin tone heads, which what's on here. But, you know, I like a ambassador thickness for my batter head. The batter head is the head you hit on the snare drum. The snare head is the head that the snares rest on, okay? Now for my snare heads, I like something really thin, like the thinnest Diplomat. So a Diplomat snare, clear head. It's like cellophane. You could wrap your sandwiches in it. Okay, that's how thin it is. So you want the thinnest possible head because that makes the drum more sensitive. So again, heads make a huge difference in the sound of a drum. If you really want to get expensive, try some calf heads. I use those quite often, and I love the way they sound, although they're expensive and they move up and down with the weather. All right? Now, the other thing I should say before I go on with the things I like about snare drums is muffling. You see here I got the Moon Gel. I'm not a huge fan of Moon Gel, but I know a lot of you use it, so I took some out today. I'm using that. But look what it did to my head. See that? Okay, so Moon Gel stains heads. And also, it's not safe to have around pets and kids unless you want your young child to eat one of these, which is dangerous, or your dog, okay? Really, I don't advise these things. Better is to use some sort of cloth. I use these things my buddy makes me. If you're interested in them, you can let me know. I'll put you in touch with them. And these are little leather pieces that go on the snare drum. I just clip them on with a binder clip. I know that doesn't look great, but all right. And then what happens is when you play the drum, it actually moves with the drum, okay, up and down. So Moon Gel is great in a pinch, but it will ruin your heads. So you go ahead and use it if you don't care what your heads look like, but it stains heads. But I'm going to use them today because I know that's what most everybody uses these days. So let's get back to, oh, by the way, I lost my train of thought. Internal muffling, what that does is it presses up against the head. So you're playing down and the head's trying to move, but an internal muffler presses up, so it's kind of a fight. So you don't want to use internal mufflers. If you have some old drums that have them, you could take them out, put them in a bag, keep them. If you sell the drum, put them back in. They will also rattle, all right? But just use external muffling. The drum will thank you for it, okay? And also the only other thing I'll say about the whole head thing is don't tune the drum out of its range. In other words, if it's a really deep drum, you can actually tune it so high that you're choking it and it sounds boxy. You don't want to do that. So try to choose a drum that sounds good in the range that you want. So if you want a high range, choose a drum like this, which is not quite a piccolo, but it's you know, I consider a piccolo 4 inches and less deep, okay? This is about 5, maybe 5.5, but it's a not deep drum, okay? So this has a good tuning range, and I like a higher pitched drum when I'm playing R&B or funk or Latin music. For jazz, I like a lower pitched snare drum, so I'll use a deeper drum. Get it? So that's, you might want to have a few snare drums. We'll talk a lot about that in the demos. Okay, so the other criteria, or the criteria besides sensitivity, is sustain. So if we take this muffler off and we hit the drum, how long it rings at a particular tuning, that's the sustain. Okay? So, and then for a rim shot, that's a good sustain. You know, I would say that's about, from start to finish, I think of this in reverberation terms or ambience, it's about a 1.8, you know? I can't help it. I'm an audio engineer too, so I always think of things in those terms. All right. So anything above a 1.5 seconds and above for sustain to me is acceptable for a snare drum. If you hit it without any muffling and it just does this, which probably isn't going to happen, don't buy the drum or send it back. There's probably something wrong with it. Okay. So sustain is important. Why is it important? Because when you do end up muffling it, which you probably will, you still want that drum to have some ring to it. So okay, so you can hear the ring there. Snare drum. So you hear that ring, and that sounds really great for all kinds of music. A great example of ring, if you want to go way back, listen to Roundabout by Yes. Listen to Bill Bruford's snare drum on that. That's the classic snare drum ring, all right, on that. So anyway, just dating myself here. Okay, and one way to test a drum for ring and sensitivity, we'll put these two together now, are rolls. So do rolls on the drum. Use all dynamics. If the roll's easier to play, that's because the drum is more sensitive and it's got more ring. In other words, it's carrying over. So. Okay? So open rows, closed rows, that's a good way to test a drum. Now, of course, I did the whole video on rim shots. I actually used this drum mostly with the snares off so you could hear the rim shot. But with the snares on, the different kinds of rim shots. That's a regular rim shot. This is a stick shot. That's down. This is up. Okay? And finally, the cross rim click. That's important because you're going to play a lot of those. So make sure that has a big, fat sound, all right? And you remember you want to go butt out like I talked about in that video, not tip out. You listen to the difference as opposed to much more solid. Okay? So check your rim shots on your drum. Good. So we talked about tunability. We talked about the strainer. Well, actually, we didn't talk about smoothness of strainer. So the strainer on the drum, which is, we'll move this for you, which is this thing here that turns the snares on and off. That's what makes it a snare drum. Okay? That's really important, that be really smooth. So no kinks. In other words, if you're struggling to turn that snare on and off, that's a big problem. Okay? And for me, it's a really big problem because if I'm playing a Broadway show or Latin music where I'm constantly turning the snare on and off, or jazz, and it's giving me trouble, that drives me nuts. So we don't want that. So really smooth action, and also not a big sound when it goes on. So you don't want it to, well, this has a great strainer, but you don't want it to sound like, I'll try to recreate it here, that, okay? You want to be able to just turn it on and have it gently engage the snares. If it makes a sound, you don't want that because when you're recording, you'll hear that, okay? So that's really important that it be smooth and functions. Also, you might, all snares are going to have some sort of adjustment here. You might want to have an adjustment here as well. Most drum set snares do not have that. Almost all orchestral snares do. I should have mentioned that before. You can adjust from both sides. That is a good, desirable thing to get that snare in balance, but it's not a deal killer at all for a drum set snare drum. All right, so it's very important when you have a mechanism with 3 different snares. In other words, on an orchestral drum with a strainer that has 3 snares, that you have an overall adjustment. So when you adjust those 3 separate snares, you can adjust them all together. That's really important. It's vital. Okay, but on a drum set snares, 1 set of snares, not that important. Okay, so that strainer is very important. Now let's talk about feel. That's a big one. So this is a mysterious little thing, but not quite sure. Someone probably did their doctoral dissertation on it. Maybe I'll look for one of those. But a drum, all drums feel different, as you all probably know. You've played lots of drums. You know, some drum sets just feel great. Why? I don't know. Could be the heads, could be the thickness of the shell, probably. Could be the weight of the drum, probably. The feel of the drum is important, and also comes response with that. So in other words, if the drum is fast, so if you hit it and it feels fast, so as you hit, you're getting a response right away, that's super desirable for me personally, and probably for you. The deeper the drum, the slower the response, because the air has to move from the top head to the bottom head and back up, and that's what creates the sound, and then the excess air comes out your vent hole, okay? That is on every drum. So that feel, I call it feedback. It's tactile. You know, when you touch your phone and you have those settings on where it buzzes, you know, a drum should have that response so you kind of feel it. Not all drums have that. Some of them feel super mushy, and that's a deal killer for me right away. I want a drum that feels really fast, so when I play it, it feels great. So that to me feels great. This is a real good feeling drum. And if I buy a drum that doesn't feel good, I get rid of it right away. All right. Build quality, you know, we talked about. We'll talk about a few more things, but Shell, obviously, is important. If you buy a staff drum, be careful. Some of the older ones, I won't mention any manufacturers, they can actually fall apart because the glue can fail. One-piece shells are desirable. These kinds of shells are made out of one piece hollowed out, which are rare, but they're never going to have a problem. All right, normally, if the wood's not dried ahead of time, it might crack. I've not had that happen. But the old steam bench shells, like the Radio Kings, they will crack, so be careful. They'll pull apart, and then the drum isn't round anymore. I've had several drums do that. In the next part of this video, I'll show you some Radio Kings that have actually done that, okay? Apply drums, fine. Normally, not many problems with apply drum. The real cheap ones will sometimes separate the glue, but it's pretty rare. But, you know, the main thing is that you want shell integrity. So a really good solid shell. And again, not much of a problem anymore with all these computer-aided machines helping people make drums. So, but on the older drums, if you buy older drums, be really careful of that. Okay. Now, dynamic range on a drum from soft to loud. We talked about that. That's another criteria. Okay. Now, looks. You know, that could be a criteria for you. It's a criteria for me. I like drums that look good. So if a drum's really pretty, you're going to say, oh, something shiny, I want that. That's all good, but it's got to sound good too. So from my experience, most drums that sound good usually look good, but not the opposite, okay? So be careful with that. But that is a criteria. It may be for you, all right? Finishes, all those things. Again, modern finishes are amazing. People are doing incredible things with inlay, things like that. It's just a great time to be a drum buyer, all right? Talk about weight for a minute. I like drums that are heavy. So this drum is pretty heavy for a wood drum. Obviously, metal drums, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to be heavier than wood drums, especially if they're made of bell brass or, you know, bronze. That's going to be very, very heavy. Weight is desirable because I feel it helps with response, which we just talked about. Also, the drum's not going to be moving around when you hit it. I've actually had lighter drums, especially old aluminum acrylites or anything. They're so light they'll move around. Also, the really old Ludwig Pioneers and even the old Black Beauties, which I own a few of those, they'll move around because they're very light. Okay, they're great drums, but they don't have hardly any weight to them. All right, and the last thing that adds to the weight are the rims. So you want to get good rims. If your drum doesn't come with them, get them. Die-cast rims are the best. Gretsch used to make really good rims. I know lots of companies are making them now. You can get, you know, Canopus makes them. Different companies make die-cast rims. Definitely change out your rims if you don't have die-cast rims. The weight helps with the tuning. It helps with the rim shots, as I talked about in my rim shot video. And they last forever. They don't bend, you know, you can hit them as hard as you want. And also get rims that are flanged. In other words, they're round on top. They're not sharp like the old leady drums and the some of these older Slingerland drums that I'll show you. They'll tear up your stick something awful. Okay? So those are the big things. So the testing for all these tests we're going to do, and we'll divide them up into different segments. I'll post the name of the drum, and then I'll have the actual drum, and I'll play it a little. We're gonna use sensitivity. We're gonna use sustain, purity of sound. We'll use some rolls and rim shots with both the snares on and off on each drum, and it'll go by pretty quick. But I just want to show you lots and lots of different drums so you can get a feel. And I'll talk a little about them. There's some stories behind them, and these will be long videos. I'll try to divide them up into wood drums and metal drums. So the wood will be all kinds of wood, and the metal will be brass, copper, bronze, steel, and all that. So stay tuned for these snare drum videos, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much.